Today we're going to discuss the global malnutrition burden. What are the causes and consequences of that burden, and what are the potential solutions to address malnutrition? We have a huge burden of malnutrition in front of us that society is going to have to deal with. We have 159 million children who are stunted or chronically undernourished, which I'll explain in a minute. We have 50 million children who are wasted or acutely malnourished. We have 41 million children who are overweight or obese. We have 2 billion people who suffer from some form of micronutrient deficiency. And last but not least, we have 2.1 billion adults who are overweight or obese, and it's rising. So a little bit more about some of these statistics and the definitions. Stunting is a measure of height for age in children under 5 years of age. So it's children who are short for their age, not only in their bodies, but also have cognitive impairments. So these children are disabled for life. Stunting can last if you don't address it into adulthood and can really be debilitating in overall development of the person, but also in developing of nations. Wasting is acute malnutrition. You often see this in humanitarian situations where there's a natural disaster or a famine. You also see it in situations, particularly in rural areas with seasonal hunger, where families cannot access enough food or produce enough food, and you'll see food shortages and wasting. Wasted children have a very high probability of dying if you don't quickly address them, hence the word acute. A lot of children suffer from micronutrient deficiencies as well as adults. What are micronutrients? These are vitamins and minerals that are essential for a wide range of health implications. Things like zinc, iron, vitamin A, vitamin D, all critical for things like immunity, skin care, eye health, etc. Many people suffer from these deficiencies, particularly iron. Roughly about 2 billion women suffer from iron deficiency. And finally, we have overweight or obesity, which is measured by body mass index or BMI. Those who are overweight have a body mass index of over 25, and those who are obese have a body mass index of over 30. And this presents a huge risk factor for issues of non-communicable disease, things like cardiovascular disease, stroke, diabetes, and cancer. You could argue that some of these burdens are seen in one person. The United States suffers from a lot of obesity, but what we're really seeing is that many countries suffer from multiple burdens. What used to be called the double burden of disease, where countries had issues of undernutrition, so stunting, and overweight and obesity, we're now seeing countries who've got triple burdens of undernutrition, overweight and obesity, and micronutrient deficiencies. This graph shows you countries as examples who are suffering from either 1, 2, or 3 of these burdens. This becomes very complicated to address in that the causes of these different burdens are multifaceted and involve not only the food system, but health system, education system, poverty reduction strategies. So some of these countries are really reeling from big burdens that are economically costly and have huge costs to society. So when looking at the map, the world map of chronic undernutrition or stunting, so children who are short for their age, we really see most of the burden lies in the tropics. We see this in sub-Saharan Africa. We see this in places of South and East Asia. You can see some of the highlighted areas, countries of conflict. DRC is highlighted. You see areas of East Africa and Southern Africa. What's a large burden of stunting? This is about 40% or more of children under 5 are stunted. And this is debilitating and crippling for countries to get out of because it takes generations to address stunting. What about wasting or acute malnutrition? Same pattern. You see in the swath of the southern tropics, you'll see high burdens of wasting. These countries will also suffer the impacts of climate change, and we might see more wasting as time goes on. Micronutrient deficiencies. This map is showing you a composite of some of the really key deficiencies that we see a lot of in the population. This is vitamin A, zinc, and folic acid or folate deficiencies. Again, you can see in the tropics, we have a huge amount of micronutrient deficiencies. But high-income countries are not immune. We see a lot of women, a lot of children who have gaps in nutrients like iron and zinc and vitamin A. Obesity is on the rise. We're seeing a trend in every country, high-income, middle to low-income countries, where obesity is on the rise. Not one country has been able to reverse these trends, and this is quite alarming. So when we think of the United States as having 60% of the population being overweight or obese, we're also seeing obesity rising in places like Latin America, the Middle East, North Africa, where women of reproductive age, up to 75% are overweight or obese. This is an alarming trend that we're seeing. So let's look at some global obesity statistics. The prevalence of overweight and obesity has risen from 27% in adults and 47% in children between 1980 and 2013. The number of overweight and obese individuals increased from 857 million in 1980 to 2.1 billion in 2013, which are our latest statistics. Both men and women's obesity has risen, roughly from about 28 or 29% to roughly 37 and 38% respectively. And interestingly, 50% of around 670 million obese live in just 10 countries. We see it in the US, we see it in China, we see it in India, Russia, and Brazil, the BRIC countries, Mexico, Egypt, Germany, Pakistan, and Indonesia. These are some of the most populated countries currently and will continue to be more populated as we go on. And we can only imagine if we don't address it now, the obesity rates will rise. We see that obesity peaks around 55 to 60 years of age. People start to decline in their body mass index, but we really see this rapid weight gain in the early adult life from 20 years of age to 40 years of age. We can also think about place. Where are we seeing obesity besides just looking at countries and regions? We're seeing it in rural areas and urban areas. So while obesity was thought to be an urban phenomena in which people become more sedentary, they sit at work, they take public transport, or they drive a car, we're also seeing an increase in obesity in rural areas as well, and this is alarming. So what are some of the causes and consequences of nutrition? This framework that I'm showing you is a very classic framework that was developed by UNICEF in 1990, and it walks you through the different causes of undernutrition that we're seeing in mainly women and children who are considered the most vulnerable. If you look at the very top, the green boxes, the immediate causes of undernutrition is a lack of food and disease. Mainly, it used to be infectious disease. When you go down further, you'll see these light blue boxes. These are the intermediate causes: food, care, and health. We know that these three factors are critically important in ensuring that you are well nourished. Care being, does a mother have the knowledge and the wherewithal and the support system to raise her child in the right way? Is she able to breastfeed? Does she have access to good complementary foods that are nutritious and safe? Is there a functional health system? Is there a healthy environment that a family lives within? Is it a clean and a hygienic environment? And food, are they food secure? What's the food system like that they're living in? And then if you start to go down into the basic causes, into the darker blue boxes, these are more of the broader causes: poverty issues, education, women's empowerment, that really are broad factors across all of development that impact nutrition. Now, most nutritionists focus on, guess what? The top, the green boxes. It's easier to address than some of these basic causes that are much more societal factors. But still, we're starting to delve into some of these lower boxes, these intermediate and basic causes, if we really want to address this global burden. What are the consequences? If you look up at the top of this framework, you see that the consequences can be issues of morbidity and mortality. Undernutrition can increase infectious disease burden, make you more susceptible to issues of disease. But there's also long-term factors, again, cognitive development, brain development, as well as your ability to be able to have a healthy baby yourself if you're a mother. And these are generational issues. So one thing to keep in mind is that really to address nutrition, you have to focus on what they call the 1,000 days. This is the 1,000 days of life, the window of opportunity from conception to 2 years of life. If you don't start addressing all of these causes that are in these boxes that you see, you really shut that window, and there's very little that you can do to address some of the consequences that you'll see later on in life. Causes and consequences of obesity are quite distinct, somewhat the same in undernutrition, but have their own issues. We get into a more complicated food environment. We get into not only genetics, we get into issues of the food environment, we get into issues of equity, and these all have implications on obesity. There's a physical activity issue with obesity as well, along with food, that is a complicated relationship. But the consequences of obesity, like I said earlier, is a higher risk of non-communicable diseases and early death. What are we seeing with non-communicable diseases? Well, non-communicable diseases are rising everywhere. This is a map showing you the mortality from non-communicable diseases. And you'll see that, again, interestingly, places like sub-Saharan Africa have higher mortality. Well, we know that in the United States, we have a pretty good health system. In Europe, a decent health system. We can start addressing some of these non-communicable diseases, either through prevention or treatment. In many poor countries or low-income countries, they don't have a functional health system to address these more complicated non-communicable diseases like diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So people are dying younger from these diseases. So we're seeing a switch now in which in places like Africa, people used to die of communicable diseases or infectious diseases, but now we're seeing a trend where more people are dying of non-communicable diseases all over the world. Another important concept to note is the intergenerational consequences of malnutrition. So a child who is born of low birth weight and stunted, if you don't engage and interact and intervene in those first 1,000 days, that child who is stunted grows up, hopefully, into a young girl, an adolescent girl, who then potentially, because she doesn't have the cognitive capacity, she may drop out of school. And that puts her at higher risk for early marriage, early pregnancies. She, being stunted herself, will have poor birth outcomes. And that cycle continues unless you intervene. So there's a lot of debate in the nutrition community where to intervene. Should we intervene at pregnancy, when women get pregnant, make sure that baby's healthy? Do we intervene once that baby's born, get the baby on the right track? Or do we intervene with adolescent girls, ensure they stay in school, get them the right nutrition so that they themselves are healthy, but that when they do get pregnant, they have healthy babies themselves? If we don't address this cycle, this intergenerational cycle of malnutrition, it's very hard to break. One last thing I wanted to comment on is the linkages between undernutrition and obesity. People often think of them as distinct. But David Barker, a British scientist, found that something happens in children who are undernourished or who are born of low birth weight. They have a higher propensity to put on weight into adulthood. It's called the fetal origins hypothesis. What they found was that children who are born of low birth weight, who are undernourished, who get a bolus of food and put on rapid weight gain, tend to have a higher risk of becoming obese in adults and dying of non-communicable diseases. So this is a terrible double fate. And there's a clear linkage now between undernutrition and overweight and obesity. And it could explain why we're seeing in low-income countries this rapid rise in obesity if we don't address the undernutrition as well.